The lake shimmered under the sharp glow of late summer sunlight, a wide sheet of blue that stretched into the horizon. Ethan leaned back against the wooden railing of the cabin porch, squinting through the glare while his best friend, Ryan, hauled a cooler down toward the dock. Their laughter had filled the air all morning, the kind of carefree noise that belonged to youth and water and warm air. Ryan's father, Mark, moved more slowly, steadying his step as he carried folded towels in his arms. He was older, yet something about his calm stride commanded attention without asking for it. Ethan noticed the man's broad shoulders beneath a simple gray t-shirt, his weathered hands that seemed used to both labor and care. It wasn't admiration he wanted to dwell on, it came unbidden, in quiet flashes he forced himself to ignore. "Bring the speaker, Ethan." Ryan shouted from the dock. Ethan jolted, grabbed the small black speaker from the porch table, and followed his friend down the slope. The wood under his sandals groaned, the scent of pine sap clinging in the air. He told himself to keep his eyes forward, but he was aware of Mark just ahead, the easy way he carried himself, the low rumble of his voice when he said, "Storm might roll in later. Don't stay out too long." The three of them settled at the edge of the dock, letting their feet dangle above the water. Music played low, the rhythm carrying across the surface. Ryan wasted no time in stripping down to his swim trunks, grinning as he cannonballed into the lake. Ethan laughed, but stayed seated for a moment, toes skimming the cool water. Mark leaned against one of the posts, folding his arms across his chest. "You're not jumping in?" Mark asked. "I will," Ethan said quickly, peeling off his shirt. He hated the way his pulse jumped, hated that he noticed how Mark's gaze lingered for half a second too long before he turned his attention back to the trees. Ethan inhaled sharply and dove in after Ryan, letting the chill swallow him whole. Hours slipped by in splashes and shouts, until the sky shifted without warning. The first drop hit Ethan's shoulder as he treaded water. Another followed, then dozens more, the lake's surface peppered with widening circles. "Rain." Ryan shouted, laughing as he swam toward shore. Ethan kicked toward the dock, but his friend was already halfway up the path, sprinting toward the cabin with the easy recklessness of someone who had grown up here. By the time Ethan pulled himself onto the wood, the storm had gathered its strength. The wind whipped across the water, driving sheets of rain sideways. "Ryan." Ethan called, but his voice vanished into the downpour. He scrambled up the dock, feet slipping against the wet boards, soaked through before he had taken 10 steps. The world blurred in silver streaks, every breath sharp with the smell of wet earth and cedar. Then, through the haze, a voice cut clear. "Ethan." He turned. Mark stood at the cabin doorway, one hand braced against the frame, his t-shirt plastered to his chest by the rain. The man's eyes found his, steady and direct even through the storm. "Come on, you'll catch your death out there," Mark called, raising his voice above the roar. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. For a second, he thought of running straight upstairs to change beside Ryan, of ignoring the way his heart hammered at the sight of Mark waiting for him in the doorway. But the rain beat harder, the chill sinking deep, and instinct pushed him forward. He dashed across the final stretch, water streaming from his hair and clothes, and stumbled up the steps. Mark reached out, steadying him with one hand at his elbow, firm and warm despite the cold all around them. "Inside," Mark said, guiding him through the doorway. The cabin swallowed the storm's noise, leaving only the muted drum of rain against the roof. Ethan stood dripping on the wooden floor, shivering, every nerve alight. He glanced up, and Mark's hand fell slowly away from his arm. The door shut with a heavy click. Ethan swallowed, aware of the silence between them, aware of how close they stood. His pulse thrummed louder than the storm outside, and though no words followed, Ethan knew something had shifted, something that couldn't be undone. The cabin's living room glowed with amber light from the fireplace Mark had lit moments before. The storm raged beyond the walls, but inside, the crackle of burning wood cast a gentler rhythm. Ethan stood awkwardly near the door, water still dripping onto the hardwood floor, the towel in his hands doing little to stop the shiver crawling up his spine. "Here," Mark said, his voice steady as he set another towel across the back of a chair. "Dry yourself off properly. No point in catching a fever." Ethan managed a nod, clutching the towel tighter. He rubbed his hair with quick motions, trying not to meet Mark's eyes. Every second in the man's presence felt amplified, as though silence carried more weight than words. Mark moved to stir the fire, crouching low, the flames outlining his shoulders in shifting light. Ryan should be upstairs by now, digging through that mess of clothes he calls a suitcase, he said, his tone casual. I told him to keep some spares for you, but knowing him, it'll take a while. Ethan forced a smile. That sounds like Ryan. He pressed the towel against his arms, but the wet fabric of his shirt clung stubbornly. Mark glanced up from the hearth, eyes settling on him with a quiet scrutiny. You'll warm faster if you change, he said. There's a stack of clean clothes in the hall closet. Take something of Ryan's for now. Ethan hesitated. Here. In the living room? Mark leaned back on his heels, resting his hands against his knees. It's warmer by the fire. Better than freezing down the hall. His words were simple, practical even, but the pause between them carried something Ethan couldn't name. With a reluctant breath, Ethan slipped his wet shirt over his head. The motion felt clumsy, too deliberate under Mark's gaze, though the older man looked away almost immediately, focusing on the fire. Almost. Ethan caught the flicker of his eyes before they turned aside. The shirt landed with a sodden thump against the floor. Ethan wrapped the towel around his shoulders, aware of every drop of water sliding down his skin. Mark rose slowly, dusting his hands against his jeans, and for a moment their eyes met. Neither spoke. The silence was not empty, it was thick, humming with unspoken questions neither dared to voice. You're in college now, right? Mark finally asked, breaking the tension. Ethan seized the lifeline. Yeah. Just finished my first year. Mark nodded, leaning against the mantel. Good age. Lots ahead of you. His voice softened. I remember when Ryan was still figuring out what he wanted. Guess he still is. Ethan laughed quietly, though his throat felt dry. Yeah, he doesn't take much seriously. That's part of youth, Mark said. His eyes lingered again, less hurried this time, as though weighing something beyond the words. You seem different, though. More reflective. The compliment struck deeper than Ethan expected. He shifted under its weight, unsure how to respond. I guess I think a lot, he admitted. Sometimes too much. Mark's mouth curved, not quite a smile, more an acknowledgement. Thinking isn't a weakness. It just means you notice what others miss. The fire popped, sending a spray of sparks into the air. Ethan stared at them, grateful for somewhere to place his eyes. His heart, however, betrayed him, quickening with each beat. He wanted to ask what Mark had noticed. He wanted to understand why his chest felt tight, why standing in this room alone with his friend's father felt more dangerous than any storm outside. The conversation faltered, replaced by silence once more. Mark reached for the towel draped across the chair and handed it to him. Their fingers brushed, an accidental touch, fleeting but electric. Ethan inhaled sharply, hoping it went unnoticed. Before either could speak, Ryan's voice carried faintly from upstairs. Ethan. I'll bring you some shorts in a sec. Ethan stepped back, clutching the towel as though it were armor. Mark straightened, clearing his throat. Good, Mark said, his tone steady again. That'll save you rummaging around. Ethan nodded, but he couldn't shake the charged look they had shared, the quiet moment broken by Ryan's voice. His chest tightened with guilt and something else he didn't want to name. Upstairs, footsteps shuffled, laughter echoing faintly. Downstairs, the fire crackled on, and Ethan stood in a heavy silence beside Mark, knowing they had both felt the shift, even if neither dared to say it aloud. Night draped itself over the cabin, the storm outside reduced to a steady drizzle. Upstairs, Ryan's snores carried faintly through the wooden beams, steady and careless. Ethan lay on the couch, staring at the ceiling, but rest refused to come. His body was warm beneath the borrowed clothes, yet his thoughts twisted restlessly, circling back to the charged silence he had shared with Mark earlier. Unable to bear the stillness, Ethan rose quietly. The floor creaked beneath his steps, though the storm's leftover hum masked most of the sound. He wandered toward the living room, guided by the faint glow of dying firelight. Mark was there, seated in the armchair by the hearth, a glass resting in his hand. The fire had burned low, embers glowing red, shadows pulling long across his face. He looked up as Ethan entered, his eyes softened by the quiet, though alert all the same. "Couldn't sleep?" Mark asked, his voice low, careful not to disturb the house. Ethan shook his head. "Too much on my mind." Mark gestured toward the chair opposite him. "Sit. The night feels shorter when you're not alone in it." Ethan obeyed, lowering himself into the seat. For a moment, the only sound between them was the occasional crackle of the embers. Ethan stole glances at Mark, tracing the lines of his face in the half-light, the wear of years resting on his features but tempered with strength. Mark swirled the glass in his hand before setting it down. "I noticed earlier," he said carefully, "the way you looked at me." Ethan froze. His pulse surged in his ears. I didn't mean, you don't have to explain." Mark's tone was calm, but his eyes didn't waver. "I just want to know if I was imagining it." The room felt suddenly airless. Ethan's throat tightened as he tried to find words. "You weren't imagining it," he admitted at last, his voice barely above a whisper. Mark leaned back, exhaling slowly. For a moment, it seemed like he might pull away, let the words dissolve into nothing. Instead, he said, "You should know this isn't simple. You're Ryan's friend. And he stopped himself, shaking his head. "I know," Ethan said, his chest tight with both guilt and longing. "But I can't stop feeling it. Not when you're right here." Silence pressed heavy, stretching between them like a rope drawn taut. Then, as though the weight became too much to bear, Mark stood and crossed the space between them. He stopped just in front of Ethan, his presence filling the air, the heat of the fire tracing the edges of his figure. "Tell me to walk away," Mark murmured, his voice roughened by restraint. Ethan looked up, every nerve alight, and whispered, "I can't." The words undid what little distance had remained. Mark bent, his hand brushing Ethan's cheek, tentative at first, then certain. Their lips met, hesitant but searing, a kiss that carried both hunger and hesitation. Ethan's breath faltered, his hands clutching at the towel draped over the chair as if anchoring himself to the moment. The kiss deepened, lingering in the quiet cabin, every second a violation of trust yet impossible to resist. For Ethan, it was a storm of its own, thrilling, terrifying, and irreversible. When they finally pulled apart, Mark's expression was shadowed with conflict. "This can't go beyond these walls," he said softly, as though the words themselves were fragile. Ethan nodded, though his chest ached with the weight of secrecy. "I understand." They sat in silence for a long moment, the fire fading into ash. Outside, the rain had slowed to a whisper. By morning, the cabin seemed unchanged. Ryan greeted them cheerfully over breakfast, oblivious, his grin as wide as ever. Ethan forced a laugh at his friend's jokes, but his eyes strayed once, then twice, to Mark across the table. Mark met his gaze briefly, then looked away, his face unreadable. Ethan chewed slowly, his heart beating with the memory of what had happened, of what could never be spoken aloud. The warmth of last night lingered like an ember, hidden but alive. He lifted his glass of water, forcing a smile to cover the storm inside him. "Some storms soak you to the bone," he thought, "but it's what comes after that leaves the deepest mark." The morning after blurred into ordinary motions, yet nothing felt ordinary to Ethan. He moved through the cabin with deliberate calm, helping Ryan clear dishes, laughing at stories that rolled too easily from his friend's tongue. But beneath every word, beneath every breath, a secret pulsed between him and Mark, silent and undeniable. Mark behaved as though nothing had happened. His voice carried the same measured tone, his posture as steady as ever. He asked Ryan about his classes, about the next football practice, about things that belonged in the safe rhythm of father and son. To Ethan, however, every glance felt heavy, every word a reminder of the night they had crossed a line. When Ryan left to fetch more firewood, the silence between Ethan and Mark returned, unspoken yet thick. Mark busied himself with the coffee pot, pouring dark liquid into 2 mugs. He slid one toward Ethan without a word. Their fingers did not touch this time, but the absence of contact made the memory of it sharper. Ethan stared into the swirling steam, forcing his voice steady. Do you regret it? Mark's hand stilled on the counter. He did not look up immediately. When he finally did, his eyes were cautious, weighed down by something Ethan couldn't read fully. I don't regret feeling it, he said at last. But I regret what it means. Ethan swallowed. The words cut more deeply than silence would have. Because of Ryan. Because of everything, Mark corrected, his jaw tightening. This isn't a road either of us can walk without consequence. The conversation ended as Ryan returned, arms full of wood, breaking the fragile honesty. Ethan forced a smile, but his stomach coiled tight. He told himself he could bear it, that the memory of one night would fade with distance. Yet every shared glance across the room told him otherwise. The day unfolded in fragments. They hiked along the wet shoreline once the rain eased, Ryan bounding ahead with the energy of someone oblivious to shadows. Mark trailed behind, steady and quiet, and Ethan found himself caught in the middle, torn between loyalty and longing. At one point, Ryan climbed a fallen log, balancing precariously as he shouted some challenge back to Ethan. Ethan laughed, but his eyes shifted instinctively toward Mark, who watched his son with a fondness softened by fatigue. Their gazes met for only a second before Mark looked away, but in that instant Ethan felt the gravity of what they shared, something unspeakable, something that would not vanish. That night, the cabin was quieter. Ryan stayed up late on his phone, stretched out on his bed upstairs. Ethan sat alone in the living room, staring at the dim firelight, waiting without admitting to himself what he was waiting for. Mark appeared at the doorway, his presence filling the room even before he spoke. He leaned against the frame, arms crossed, expression unreadable. You should try to sleep, Mark said. I can't, Ethan admitted. For a long moment, neither moved. The unspoken promise of the previous night hung between them, dangerous and magnetic. Mark finally stepped closer, lowering his voice. This can't become a habit. You know that. Ethan nodded, though the ache in his chest deepened. But you still came. Mark's silence was answer enough. He sat across from Ethan, the distance deliberate this time. His eyes lingered, but his hand stayed firmly in his lap. I need you to understand, he said, his voice carrying both sternness and softness. What happened, it can't define you. Or me. It was a moment, not a path. Ethan nodded again, though the words only tangled further in his mind. He wanted to believe him, yet every glance, every pause, every heartbeat told him the storm wasn't over, it had only changed form. When Ryan's footsteps creaked above, both men fell silent. The moment dissolved into stillness, leaving only the fire to fill the space. Mark rose first, retreating toward the hall without another word. Ethan sat alone, the embers glowing faintly, his thoughts louder than the crackle of wood. He knew the weekend would end, the cabin would empty, and life would resume. But something had been carved into him, into them both, and though he didn't know where it would lead, he knew this wasn't an ending. It was only the beginning of a silence they would carry, one secret, two hearts, and a storm that refused to pass.